Hello, I'm the Angry Spork. You know what we haven't talked about in a while? Proper lumbar support. Well, that and Marvel's 1995 Gargoyles comic.
Previously on Gargoyles.
The Manhattan Clan ran afoul of mob boss Tony Dracon, who stumbled upon a means of tracking our heroes. The winged warriors gave him a resounding thrashing while helping Elisa Mazza find evidence connecting Dracon's men to the murder of a small-time hoodlum and the kidnapping of his girlfriend. We also checked in on an ongoing subplot involving one Dr. Phobos, a scientist working for David Xanatos that was on the cusp of, among other things, creating their own gargoyles. Phobos likes to go the extra mile for his Etsy business. One test subject didn't seem to pan out until she sprang back to life and killed the guy that was going to dump her in the ocean. She'd prefer to be dumped in Lake Superior, thank you very much. Sure, she's got blood on her hands, but does that mean she can't find love? After all, blood is red, and it's Valentine's Day, and you got the heart shapes and... Okay, I've lost the metaphor. I'm taking issue with Gargoyles number 4 from Marvel, written by Martin Pasco and Mort Todd, joined with art by Amanda Connor, Alberto Saichan, and Anthony Tolan. Let's see if this comic makes us want to turn the page, or turn our heads. The cover sees Broadway and a mysterious winged woman holding hands and smiling as they fly across the sky, though Lexington and Brooklyn follow close behind, looking rather sinister. This was the 90s, so maybe they're just ticked off that the overweight illiterate guy got a date to Gargoyle prom before they did. They've got bigger problems to deal with since they're about to be crushed by, well, it's probably supposed to be the moon, but given the texture and shine of the edge, it looks like a giant everlasting gobstopper. The lady is a vamp. That's right, she's actually an improvised series of chords accompanying jazz music. We begin in that seedy nightclub where the murder I mentioned happened, Sacrilege, where Beth Mazza is being harassed by several creeps, whom she tells to back off. Figuring maybe her older sister Elisa was right, and she's in over her head, she decides to take off, watched from above, out of sight of the dancers, by a woman in shadow, who holds a now-dead man, blood on his neck and her mouth. Oh, vamp, I get it now. She's that part of your shoe that covers your toes. Duh. Unfortunately, Jocko and his boys don't understand or care about being told no, following her out into an alley. She's thrown to the ground and he pulls a knife, threatening retaliation for dissing them as we go from standard narration to excerpts from Elisa's personal diary, how she tried to warn her sister about certain dangers in the big city, but was ignored. Good thing she had Broadway to keep an eye on her just in case, as he swoops in and takes them all down in one hit. Way to use your size to your advantage.
Laugh with me, Jocko. Laugh with me.
When this unfamiliar being says her name, Beth figures she's been dosed with something and calls for a taxi, which makes Broadway confident she'll get home safely now. Yep, no possible way she could run into any other creeps or be hit by an oncoming car when she's not looking. Those 4 punks he knocked out were the only ones scheduled to threaten young women that night. The big guy thinks to himself how he'd like to find a friend, one that's like Elisa is to Goliath, and not just because those two become canonically involved. He's approached by the mysterious woman on the cover, wings and all, having watched his rescue and wishing he'd been there to help when something terrible happened to her at this same club. It was the most boring timeshare presentation I ever sat through. She says her name is Levon, and while a lot like Broadway, she is not a gargoyle. He asks if she'd like to grab a bite, and even though she just ate, she's always hungry and would love to hang out with him, somewhere else, so they can talk. They hit a few eateries, first a White Castle, I guess because the castle-like structure makes Broadway nostalgic for his own era, then a pizzeria, then a hot dog place, with Broadway, of course, having much more than Levon, because he's always hungry too. He often gets teased for it, but she knows what it's like to fight the hunger, and would never laugh at him for it. Oh, and one small detail, they're noticed by humans while doing this! I mean, the pizza joint looked like it was closed. That spilled mop bucket suggests someone was there, or maybe one of them tipped it over by mistake, but someone sees them through the window! And a worker at the hot dog place just has a confused look as they walk out, as Broadway remarks how weird it is they haven't had to pay for anything, just given food and sent on their way. The whole angle for the Gargoyles in this point is that they had to stick to the shadows because people didn't believe they existed and would react violently or fearfully at the sight of them. Yet here, people are seeing them and barely batting an eye as they're out in the open going on a fast food crawl. Broadway even mentions the previous issue where a housewife made him all sorts of food, so again, people were seeing him, but the only consequence so far is that he didn't get to try latkes. Yeah, we saw Beth run in fear of him, but so far, several more people just seem to shrug off this humanoid creature, but still not charging him for food for some reason.
In Meepos, money is not that important. 2 chickens is a pig, 2 pigs is a cow, and 2 cows is a fortune.
It's like when some superhero comics have costume heroes call out their civilian names out in the open with villains nearby. Does the secrecy matter or not? Anyway, they're flying along as Broadway realizes he's been doing all the talking and asks about Levon, when she starts falling out of the sky. If you want to end the date, you could just say you're tired and need to get home. Fake fainting in the air is kind of an extreme response, don't you think? He catches her, blaming himself for stuffing her with all that food, but she insists it was merely a dizzy spell. She had a wonderful time and would like to see the gargoyle again, hopefully becoming good friends, and he promises to meet her again as he heads back home. Back at the club, Elisa and some other cops are surrounding a dead body, ID'd as Melvin Alto, a petty crook with connections to David Xanatos. While the broken glass and his history of suffering from vertigo suggests he fell from the window a couple stories above, it turns out he's been drained of his blood. What? Are you telling me we have a vampire on the loose? Either that or those people at the blood bank are getting way more aggressive.
Could be. Or a blood-sucking gargoyle, maybe.
If you're not careful, you'll get us all whacked. Body in a wood chipper.
Elisa heard the sound of wings gliding on the wind, figuring it was one of her nocturnal friends, and curious why they'd be out so close to sunup, only to casually look and find no one there, then brushes off her colleague's superstitious remarks and leaves. Then we switch back to third-party narration, how it was actually Levon returning to her just crime, taking a dash of revenge by killing Melvin. She begins reminiscing about her old life, how up until a few days ago that feel like a lifetime, she was a directionless young woman that saw her boyfriend Price get murdered outside Sacrilege back in issue 2. From there, Tony Dracon's men gave her to Dr. Phobos, where she was experimented on in the Genutech lab, injected with a formula and electroshocked in the nude for some reason, though narration calls them Thanarays, in an effort to create a vampire that would be attractive to gargoyles. At least that's what Dr. Phobos told everyone after they found out the keywords in his search history. The vampgoyle's objective would be to seduce the target, drain their blood, and then bring it back to Genutech for experimentation, by storing the blood in her cheeks, like a squirrel. After her mutation, Levon seemed to have died and was taken to the water for disposal, like so many before her, but when the moon rose, she awoke to new unlife, then feasted on the driver of the boat. Turns out when she drinks a victim's blood, she gains some memories and knowledge, and in the case of her recent kill, Mr. Alto, vertigo, side effects from the flawed formula she was given. While maintaining a thirst for gargoyle blood, she's no longer under Genutech's control, and chooses to fight them as she hides from the sun in a room above the nightclub. And she tells herself that her existence will become whole later that night. Whoa! You just met Broadway, lady! Don't rush into anything you'll regret later. Elisa returns home to Beth's rendition of Broadway's rescue, still nerve-wracked about the experience, and asks why her big sis didn't warn her about sacrilege, only for the detective to point out she did everything she could to warn her while not being a nag, but Beth wouldn't listen. This offends the younger woman, feeling like she's being treated like a child for wanting to live her life, and a fed-up Elisa goes off to her room to sleep before her next shift, and tells Beth to keep quiet if she's going to live it up, and not to get killed in the process. Natural sibling dialogue if I ever read it. That night, Elisa staked out sacrilege for the vampire murderer when Dracon's right-hand man Glasses strolls into the nearby alley, unaware of being watched. Since he's tied to the murder from issue 2, Maza grabs her sidearm and proceeds to tail him, while wearing what looks like a Santa Claus coat. This issue is dated from May 1995. Stop trying to start the Christmas season so early! Levon dives to take out Glasses for his part in what happened to her, and Elisa instantly realizes this must be the vampire killer, because I guess Levon's promise of making Glasses suffer a slow death was all the proof she needed.
You're every bit the detective that your followers on the internet believe.
She tries to stop the mutate from following through on the threat, but gets knocked away, Levon claiming to have watched the cop and how she was no help when her boyfriend was killed, and isn't any help now.
This witch is bugging!
Clearly, she needs a software update. Seems a little odd to claim she was watching Elisa when she's only been up and about for a short time. I mean, Mazza and the Gargoyles did get the evidence tying Price's murder to Dracon's men, though the comic doesn't elaborate on how that investigation is going since issue 3. But hey, I'm sure any of us would be confused with rage if we were bioengineered into a blood-sucking predator out for revenge. Despite clearly able to overpower them both, she just takes off, vowing to bide her time and drain the henchman, the cop, and eventually the Gargoyles. Gargoyles? Everyone's talking about Gargoyles! When Disney doesn't advertise their properties like they should, you gotta rely on word of mouth. She starts questioning Glasses about his attacker, but he claims he's just the victim of assault, which is Goliath's cue to pick him up and gently stroke his head.
I will name him George, and I will hug him and pet him and squeeze him.
You seem fine, considering the fragile skeleton you humans sport. I imagine Wolverine is somewhere feeling extra smug about his adamantium right about now, but moving on. He coaxes Glasses to answer Elisa's questions, admitting that after the girl witnessed her boyfriend's murder, they had to take care of her, so forked her over to Xanatos' men. Apparently, he somehow heard about her being turned all vampire-like, which might have something to do with the Gargoyles. Xanatos should really consider tamping down on the goons and goons of his associates chatting about his secret plans. You know the old saying, loose lips sink ships, containing illegal science labs experimenting on unwilling human test subjects. Well, island science labs in this case, but you get my point. In their clock tower roost, Broadway is getting himself ready for his next meetup with Levon, doing some manner of primping to look good as he's being teased by Lex and Brooklyn, doing mock feminine poses and asking if his new friend is as rotund as he is, because there's nothing ironic or hypocritical about creatures often derided as monsters for how they look, making fun of someone they've never met and their potential appearance. Hudson tries to warn Broadway, asking what he really knows about this woman.
Things are not always as they seem in this new world, especially with bonny females.
Yeesh, sounds like Hudson's already been the victim of catfishing. The big guy is not worried, promising Levon couldn't hurt a fly, and leaves to meet with her. The old warrior goes to watch TV when a news report comes on, confirming reports of a serial murderer, draining victims of blood, and coinciding with sightings of unknown figures flying across the city. And since this is a Marvel comic, we are contractually bound to blame these vampire-like killings on Spider-Man. This news has reached David Xanatos, who's becoming rather displeased with the security breaches from Phobos' island base, especially when the creature is so clearly from Genutech. Phobos admits that a test subject was mistakenly released from the failed Project Nosferatu, which wasn't a total failure, turns out, but David warns of the ramifications if the subject doesn't follow its prime directive. She can only get away from ignoring it if she's voiced by Kate Mulgrew and has a really complicated and convoluted reason for doing it. The rich man just wants Project Medusa to succeed, ending the call, pondering that Genutech may need some of his personal attention. In his lab, Phobos derides his boss as a pompous fool, demanding more from the scientist despite his accomplishments. He does plan to have the Medusa device ready, better than expected, but has a backup plan should it fail, and Xanatos no longer feels he's needed, as we see a shapely female form inside a stasis chamber, someone whom Phobos says will show no mercy to those who stand in his way once she's released into the world. The secret origin of Miley Cyrus. Meanwhile, Broadway is flying Levon to the clock tower to meet the clan. Brooklyn and Lexington are instantly taken with her, fumbling their words, calling her a babe, and not being subtle with the hubba hubba, to the point it almost feels they're about to go full Wayne's World.
In Latin, she would be called Babia Majora.
If she were a president, she'd be Abraham Lincoln.
Though if you know how Greg Weisman had originally intended Lexington to be gay, you can figure that either the writers of the book didn't know that, or maybe it was just not allowed because of public attitudes at the time. It reads different in any event. Also, they seem surprised she has wings, which suggests the big guy somehow didn't mention that about her, so did they think she was human? As Levon tries and fails to curry favor with the normally friendly Bronx, who growls at her, Hudson pulls Broadway aside, saying something that isn't elaborated in speech bubbles.
Lad, be honest. Do you think she's into grey hair and battle scars?
Much to Broadway's chagrin, Levon invites his rookery brothers to join them for a flight on the town, where the three soon start bickering and boasting about themselves to impress her, not unlike when Angela joined the cast in season 2. Though Levon looks to be enjoying it by contrast. Could be some of that latent gargoyle hunting programming, or maybe she likes seeing guys fight over her. A couple nearby vandals are spray painting the side of a bridge when one spots the flyers and is so shocked by the sight of them, loses his grip and falls, likely to his death. Such a shame. He was only 1 day away from retirement. From tagging public property. Bit of a goof, the dialogue bubbles between him and his friend aren't well attributed. One in the vest seems to call his bandana-sporting buddy Plaz, asking him what's wrong, but it's Vest Boy who sees the Goyles, and somehow the guy with his back turned to them is the one warning about them. Yet when he falls, Bandana calls him Plaz. It can be a bit confusing for such a dramatic moment. The guys argue over who's going to save the kid, but it's Levon who spares him from becoming concrete casserole. Narration says she did so without a second thought, slicing past the trio that she'd been having fun with, and actually felt a heretofore unknown sense of belonging. But her attention is drawn to his soft, exposed neck, igniting a naked hunger in her. But it's a PG nakedness, where you only see it from the back and above the shoulder blades. Broadway's praise keeps her from giving in, so they drop the kid on the bridge and glide along. But tensions rise again, as the big guy emphasizes Levon is his friend.
Since when did she sign an exclusive deal with you?
Last night on a cocktail napkin, which I used to patch up a hole in her tarp dress. See, it's right there. She kinda tries to get them to stop, to no avail, but the fight with Lex makes Broadway accidentally smack Brooklyn in the beak, which I guess he takes personally. He charges for retaliation, but not even Lexington's oddly expository warning of Broadway ducking away can prevent the collision that takes the two into an abandoned building.
Missed it by that much.
Levon convinces her rotund suitor to ditch the other two, since he's the one she wants alone time with, and unable to say no, he goes along. Lex and Brooke are realizing how terribly they were acting, losing self-control around Levon, but deciding not to follow the two since she's Broadway's friend. Yeah, nothing suspicious about your buddy going off on his own with, as he stated, the first female who ever liked him, who also seemed to influence your aggressive behavior toward each other. It's fine. And Lex's comment about what good buddies they are reads kinda strange, given the mockery they lobbed at their heavy-set bro earlier. Meanwhile, Doc Phobos is having another video chat with Xanatos, who's lying in bed, which seems rather awkward, but hey, rich supervillains, I guess. The Medusa device is ready for initial testing, and while there's been no progress on the matter of weapons being taken, security has been intensified. David orders a prototype of the device prepared for immediate delivery, and wants to be told when everything is ready, ending the call. As he relaxes, he notes how the doc didn't mention his project in reproducing Gargoyles' cells in a while, so may be hiding something. Perhaps he's let too much slide at Genutech, and will have to visit Dr. Phobos' island soon. Kinda feels repetitive since he alluded to having to take a more personal hand several pages back, but moving on. And as an evil man falls into the sleep of the contented, a morally neutral man is really exhausted but still awake because he can't stop playing Skyrim. It's a while later as we go to Levon confessing to Broadway the nature of her hunger, how she's tried to fight it all night, nearly bit that tagger earlier, and now is after the gargoyle's blood. They begin struggling, the woman saying he was the only one that was ever nice to her, didn't treat her like dirt like so many others, but after Genutech altered her mind and body, she exists only to take his blood, and begs Broadway to stop her. He has a revelation of his own, that Hudson had informed him earlier of her ordeal before they left the clock tower, and while he wasn't at first open to believe that, he does want to help, knowing she can fight her impulses. Think of baseball, sad puppies, read some scripture, take a cold shower! She says the only way to stop her is to kill her, and she's overwhelmed by bloodlust as she bites into Broadway's neck. He apologizes, holding her close as the sun begins to rise. He turns to stone, and she begins to burn, screaming in pain as they fall, a considerable height, I'll point out, into a neglected greenhouse, Broadway's inanimate form clutching Levon's skeletal remains. The comic ends with narration commenting on his hopes of a special connection turning to dust, and while the troubled young woman wouldn't draw blood from stone, she managed to get tears from stone. Boo! Don't worry, Broadway. In a couple of seasons, you'll find new love. And by Gargoyle standards, she's definitely an upgrade. That was Gargoyles number 4. And while I liked the premise, it kind of felt rushed in the last several pages, and hurt the story in the process. With Goliath being closer to Elisa than the others, and him often being her go-to gargoyle, it makes sense that others in the clan would want to have similar connections to the modern world as well. With Broadway leaning into the fat dumb guy trope, despite having more complexity and depth in the show, of course he'd jump at the chance to hang out with someone more conventionally attractive. The Wilma to his Fred, or Leah Remini to his Kevin James, as it were. The more sinister angle that Levon was a victim twisted into preying on gargoyles, something the audience is aware of before our heroes, nicely adds suspense as the events transpire. There's a lot of narration to sum up Levon's experience, which isn't inherently bad, because the alternative would be her clunkily expositing to herself in a way that people generally don't speak. And on a related note, there were a couple of times where Elisa read a little differently than how she spoke in the show. However, while it makes sense that the clan would be told about what Glass has revealed, why is Hudson telling Broadway this? Why not Goliath or Elisa? You'd think at least one of them would be present when they hear about someone new in their friend's life whose description eerily matches a new killer in town. Weirder still, Lexington and Brooklyn were in the huddle when Hudson broke the news, so they were aware of how dangerous Levon could be, yet continue behaving like she's just the new hot girl to fight over. This could be partially explained by whatever altered Levon to help her seduce the gargoyles. Probably pheromones, but the comic never specifies. Yet they were apparently outside her influence when deciding to leave her alone with Broadway, like they didn't know her potential threat. And the big guy revealing he knew what happened to her in the second-to-last page makes the resolution feel really rushed. Perhaps having most of their one-on-one bonding happening in a montage-like series of panels in the first quarter of the book, while focusing on other scenes and then involving Brooke and Lex, contributed to any sense of glibness I detected. And the side effect of Levon's transformation don't really come into play that much. She takes on some memories and sensory traits of her victims, but it largely only comes up when she has moments of vertigo. Other people are mentioned as having fallen prey to her off-panel, but no indication of how many, if at all, were connected to Dracon or Xanatos, like was her intention. She did struggle to control her hunger, so it's possible some victims were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Though, depending on personal tastes of said victims and given her still human attractiveness, maybe some of them didn't mind so much. Perhaps the pacing issue could have been addressed with more page space devoted to clarifying certain things, like why this human genetically altered to resemble a gargoyle was given a vampire's weakness to sunlight. The whole blood-sucking thing I get, but why leave that in? Did they use some vamp DNA and they couldn't take it out or something? Would she have been opposed to garlic and crucifixes too? 3 two-page spreads seemed a bit much for a one-off story, so maybe you could have condensed one or two of them, though I would definitely keep the one with her flashbacks. The panels placed within her wings is an excellent visual. As for the last page, yeah, the narration gets really cheesy, and as it is, the scene kind of strains willing disbelief that a bed of roses was enough to prevent Broadway's wing from breaking off, at least, especially given how high it seems they fell. That said, the scene overall does a good job of showing his sorrow at losing her, whether he'd hoped they'd be more than friends or not. And while I never read the original Hunchback of Notre Dame story, I have heard how it ends, and I feel maybe this was perhaps influenced by it to a degree. But hey, I could be wrong. The art is still as good as the previous issues. They do closely resemble the cartoon designs, but altered ever so slightly for the artist's style. And yeah, there was that dialogue bubble misattribution I mentioned. And maybe it's because of the dark hair, but Vamp Levon looks an awful lot like Gargoyle Elisa. It's a nice story that could have been better with more room to breathe in certain areas. It felt too rushed for a one-off, but making it a two-parter may have produced too much padding. There's definitely a sweetness to it that got a little soured in execution. I'm the Angry Spork, and man, have I got issues.